An elderly black woman, poised and graceful, steps into first class, a world she's more than earned a place in. But a young, ambitious flight attendant, blinded by her own biases, decides Margaret Carter doesn't belong. Her dismissive attitude and outright refusal to serve Margaret set off a chain of events that will not only change her career, but challenge her very understanding of respect and equality. What happens when prejudice meets power and integrity? This is a moving story of justice, transformation, and the strength it takes to rise above. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. If you believe in stories that inspire change and celebrate resilience, don't forget to hit that like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories. Your support helps us bring powerful narratives like this to life. Now, let's get into it. Margaret stepped onto the plane with the quiet elegance of someone who had faced storms and emerged stronger. At 68, her silver-streaked hair framed a face that carried both wisdom and grace. Dressed in a tailored navy suit, with a pearl necklace resting gently on her collar, she exuded a quiet confidence that made people turn their heads, not out of recognition but curiosity. Passengers seated in the economy class watched as she made her way to the first-class cabin. A hushed murmur rippled through the rows. Who was this older black woman walking so assuredly to the front of the plane? Emily, the head flight attendant, noticed her immediately. With her blonde hair pinned tightly into a bun and her uniform pristine, Emily had always prided herself on maintaining order on her flights. Today, she was particularly focused. She had just received word that a VIP would be on board, and she was determined to make an impression. This could be her chance to finally secure a promotion. But as her eyes landed on Margaret, doubt crept in. She scanned Margaret from head to toe. The tailored suit was impressive. The pearls certainly not fake, but something about her just didn't fit the image Emily had in mind for someone sitting in first class. "Excuse me, ma'am," Emily said, stepping in front of Margaret just as she reached the plush first-class seats. Her voice was polite, but the undertone was unmistakable. "Are you sure you're in the right section? Perhaps I can help you find your assigned seat." Margaret paused, her soft smile unwavering. "Thank you, dear, but I believe I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." She held up a boarding pass, a first-class ticket, before gracefully taking her seat. Emily froze for a moment, then quickly regained her composure. "Of course, ma'am. Let me know if you need anything." But the way she turned on her heel, the tension in her shoulders, said everything. Emily returned to the galley, fuming. "Can you believe that?" She hissed to another flight attendant. "She's in first class." Her colleague, a younger woman with dark brown hair, frowned. "What's wrong with that? Her ticket says first class." "It's not about the ticket," Emily snapped. "It's just something doesn't add up. Who does she think she is?" Meanwhile, Margaret settled into her seat, adjusting the small pillow behind her back. She glanced out the window, letting the murmurs around her fade. This wasn't her first time facing scrutiny or doubt. It likely wouldn't be her last. But today, she wasn't in the mood to let it bother her. Behind her, another passenger took notice of the interaction. Sarah, a 35-year-old junior flight attendant, stood near the galley, observing the scene. Unlike Emily, Sarah's gaze wasn't filled with judgment. It was concern. She had seen this kind of tension before and knew how quickly it could escalate. Emily, still bristling, made her way back to Margaret with an almost forced smile. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I'll need to see your boarding pass again. It's just a routine check." Margaret looked up from the book she had just opened. Her calm demeanor didn't waver, though her eyes held a quiet steel. "I already showed you my ticket. Is there something else I can help you with?" Passengers began to notice the exchange. A man seated across the aisle leaned slightly forward, his curiosity piqued. Margaret handed over her boarding pass without a word, and Emily scanned it with unnecessary thoroughness before handing it back. "Thank you," Emily said curtly. "Enjoy your flight." But as she walked away, her expression betrayed her frustration. Back in the galley, Emily couldn't let it go. "I'm going to have security check this out," she announced. "Emily, don't you think that's overkill?" Sarah interjected gently. "She's just sitting there, minding her business." Emily shot her a look. "You don't understand. This is about protocol. If something feels off, we have to address it." Sarah hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. She knew arguing would only make things worse, but deep down she felt uneasy. Something about Emily's determination felt personal. Margaret, meanwhile, remained seated, her book open but unread. She could feel the tension in the air, the sideways glances from other passengers, the murmurs just loud enough to hear. She sighed softly, her fingers brushing the small gold wedding band on her hand. A young man seated nearby, a businessman named Michael Chen, watched the scene unfold with growing unease. He had seen enough viral videos to recognize when something wasn't right. Quietly, he pulled out his phone, angling it discreetly toward Margaret and Emily. Moments later, Emily returned, this time with a uniformed security officer. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside for a moment," she said, her tone coldly professional. Margaret stood, her posture dignified. "And why is that?" "It's just a routine check," Emily replied, though her tight smile suggested otherwise. Sarah stepped forward, her voice firm. "Emily, this isn't necessary. She's already shown her boarding pass twice." Emily ignored her. "Ma'am, please come with us." Margaret glanced at Sarah, offering a faint smile of reassurance. Then she reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. "I believe this should clear things up," Margaret said calmly, dialing a number. The room seemed to hold its breath as she pressed the phone to her ear. The call connected almost instantly. "Robert," Margaret said, her voice steady. "It seems there's a bit of a misunderstanding here. Would you mind clarifying things?" At the other end of the line, Robert's voice carried through the speaker. "Of course, my love. Put me on." Margaret handed the phone to Emily, whose face had gone pale. She took the phone with trembling hands. "Hello? Is this Emily?" Robert's voice boomed. "You are speaking to Robert Carter, founder of this airline. I understand you've been giving my wife a hard time. Care to explain why?" Emily stammered, her confidence crumbling. Passengers around them began murmuring, some leaning forward to catch the exchange. Robert continued, his tone sharp. "I suggest you apologize to Margaret right now and ensure she has a pleasant flight. I'll be discussing this matter further with management." Emily turned to Margaret, her face flushed. I'm so sorry, ma'am. I didn't mean to." Margaret raised a hand, her expression still calm. "Apology accepted. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'd like to return to my seat." As Margaret sat back down, the tension in the cabin dissipated, replaced by the quiet buzz of passengers whispering about what had just happened. Sarah shot Margaret a small, grateful smile. Michael Chen, still holding his phone, muttered, "This is definitely going viral." Margaret opened her book again, her posture relaxed as if nothing had happened. But the glint in her eyes suggested she had expected this all along, and had handled it with grace. Margaret sat back in her seat, the quiet murmurs around her fading into the background. The confrontation had ended, but the energy in the cabin still hung heavy with tension. She opened her book again, her fingers lightly tracing the edges of the pages, though her eyes remained unfocused. Across the aisle, Michael Chen, the observant businessman, adjusted his phone discreetly. He had recorded every moment of the interaction, and as he reviewed the footage, a soft sigh of disbelief escaped him. It wasn't just what had happened that struck him, it was how Margaret had handled it, with a dignity that left him impressed. At the back of the plane, Emily leaned heavily against the galley counter. Her mind replayed Robert Carter's commanding voice, echoing in her ears. With each passing second, founder of the airline, the realization hit her like a wave, leaving a bitter taste in her mouth. How could she have been so careless? She had prided herself on being meticulous, always prepared, yet here she was, her professionalism unravelling before the very passengers she aimed to impress. Her face burned with shame, but mixed with it was something sharper, resentment. That woman in first class, so calm, so composed, had made her look small. No, Emily corrected herself. You made yourself look small. Sarah, standing a few feet away, watched Emily carefully. Something about the older woman in first class had stirred something in Sarah, a quiet admiration for her poise in the face of disrespect. Margaret reminded her of her own mother, a woman who had faced similar microaggressions all her life, but carried herself with unshakable grace. Sarah wanted to say something to diffuse the tension that lingered in the galley, but Emily's stiff posture warned her to tread lightly. Emily broke the silence first. "You don't understand," she muttered, her voice tight. "This wasn't about her ticket." "Then what was it about?" Sarah asked gently. Emily's jaw clenched. She didn't respond. Instead, she straightened her uniform and stepped out into the aisle, her smile back in place like armor. Passengers noticed her presence, their eyes following her movements with barely concealed judgment. She forced herself not to look at Margaret as she passed. Margaret, meanwhile, let out a slow, steady breath. She hadn't missed the stares or the whispers, but neither had she allowed them to unsettle her. She had been in a situation like this, and it likely wouldn't be the last. But this time, something was different. This time, she had a partner in her corner. She glanced down at the simple gold ring on her finger, a small smile touching her lips as she thought of Robert. Her mind drifted back decades earlier, to a time when she had walked the same polished floors, though under vastly different circumstances. She had been just 22 years old, working double shifts as a janitor at the airport to pay for college. She had spent long nights cleaning terminals, scrubbing floors, and emptying trash cans, all while dreaming of a life far beyond the confines of her current reality. Even then, Margaret had carried herself with the same quiet determination that now defined her. One evening, while cleaning an executive lounge, she had overheard a heated conversation between two men. One of them, a tall, imposing figure with a booming voice, was clearly frustrated. His flight had been delayed, and he was venting about how it would derail an important business deal. Margaret had hesitated for a moment, her mop paused mid-stroke. Then, summoning her courage, she had stepped forward. "Excuse me, sir," she had said, her voice steady despite the nerves thrumming in her chest. "I think I might have a solution." The man had turned, his brows furrowed, but there was curiosity in his gaze. "You do?" Margaret had explained her idea, a simple but effective way to reroute resources and accommodate the delay. It had been unconventional but logical, and it worked. The man's frustration had melted into admiration. That man, of course, was Robert Carter. It was their first meeting, but far from their last. What began as mutual respect had blossomed into something much deeper over the years, a partnership built on shared values and unwavering support. Margaret's thoughts returned to the present as the plane settled into its cruising altitude. She allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction, knowing Robert was already working behind the scenes to address the situation. Across the aisle, Michael Chen was typing rapidly on his phone, clearly preparing to post about what he had just witnessed. Margaret caught his eye briefly and offered a small nod of acknowledgement. He returned it, a silent promise of support. Miles away, in a sleek, modern office, Charles Wilson sat at his desk, a smirk playing on his lips as he read the report about the incident. Wilson had always been a man who thrived on opportunity, and this situation was no exception. He and Robert had been at odds for years. Robert with his idealistic vision of a fair and inclusive airline, and Wilson with his cutthroat focus on profitability and power. Wilson had spent years quietly chipping away at Robert's influence within the company, using every bureaucratic loophole and political maneuver he could find. This incident with Margaret, it was a gift, a chance to turn public perception against the Carter legacy. He picked up his phone and dialed his assistant. "I want every detail of this incident on my desk by the end of the day," he said. "Focus on protocol violations. If there's even a shred of negligence, I want it documented." Back on the plane, Emily stood frozen in the galley, her mind racing. The murmurs among the passengers had grown louder, and she could feel their judgment weighing on her. Her chest tightened with a mix of shame and stubborn pride. She knew she had overstepped, but admitting it felt like an impossibility. Her carefully constructed image of professionalism was already cracking, and she wasn't sure how much more she could take. Sarah approached Margaret's seat, her movements measured and deliberate. "Ma'am," she said softly, "I just wanted to say I'm sorry for everything that's happened. If there's anything you need, please don't hesitate to ask." Margaret looked up, her warm smile immediately putting Sarah at ease. "Thank you, dear," she said, "but you have nothing to apologize for. Sometimes these things happen. The important thing is how we choose to respond." Sarah nodded, her respect for Margaret growing with each passing moment. There was something deeply inspiring about the older woman's grace under pressure. It made Sarah think about her own journey, about the kind of person she wanted to become. As Sarah walked away, the intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've been informed of a situation on board, and I'd like to assure you that it's being addressed. Please remain seated and enjoy the flight." Margaret's lips curved into a faint smile. Robert's voice wasn't on the intercom, but his influence was unmistakable. Emily's face turned pale as the weight of the captain's words settled over her. She glanced toward first class, where Margaret sat calmly, her book opened in her lap as though nothing had happened. But the glint in her eye told a different story. Margaret was no stranger to storms, and she had no intention of backing down. The passengers, meanwhile, whispered among themselves, their curiosity piqued. Michael Chen typed a final sentence into his phone and hit send. "This is going to go viral," he muttered, his tone a mix of disbelief and certainty. Margaret turned the page in her book, her posture relaxed and unbothered, but in her mind she was already preparing for what came next. The storm was far from over, but Margaret Carter had weathered far worse, and she wasn't just ready for the next move, she was already 2 steps ahead. The murmurs of restless passengers hummed like background static as Margaret remained seated, her focus firmly on the pages of her book. She wasn't reading. Not really. Her eyes scanned the words, but her thoughts wandered, circling the quiet storm that had just passed and the one she knew was still brewing. Across the aisle, Michael Chen tucked his phone into his pocket. The video he had just sent out was already gaining traction, but his curiosity lingered on the older woman with the serene composure of someone far too experienced to let indignities like these unsettle her. Further down the aisle, Emily stood frozen near the galley, her polished facade crumbling by the second. Her fingers trembled slightly as she poured a glass of water. The murmurs of the passengers, the judgment in their eyes, it was too much. The smooth flight she had planned for was slipping through her fingers, and she knew it. Sarah passed by, a soft voice breaking Emily's spiraling thoughts. "Take a breath, Emily," Sarah said gently. "It's not the end of the world." Emily shot her a glance that was equal parts defensive and weary. "You don't understand," she said. "This wasn't just a mistake. I crossed a line." "You did," Sarah admitted, her tone firm but without malice. "But the question is, what are you going to do about it now?" Emily had no answer. She turned away, walking briskly toward the cockpit to check on the pilots, or so she told herself. In truth, she just needed a moment away from everyone. As the plane cruised smoothly at 30,000 feet, Margaret let her mind wander to memories of years gone by. It wasn't the first time she had felt the weight of someone's doubt pressing against her, nor the first time she had risen above it. She thought back to the first time she'd met Robert, in that very same airport decades ago. She could still recall the sound of her footsteps echoing on the polished floor as she approached him. Robert had been a force of nature even back then, tall, imposing, and determined to build something extraordinary. But on that particular day, he had been a man facing an impossible situation, a major flight delay that threatened to derail a critical business deal. Margaret, then a young janitor working her way through college, had been cleaning the lounge when she overheard his heated conversation with the airport staff. She could have stayed silent. It wasn't her place to intervene. But something inside her urged her forward. "Excuse me," she had said, her voice steady despite the nerves fluttering in her chest. "I think I might have a solution." Robert had turned to her, his brow furrowed, his sharp eyes sizing her up. "Do you?" he'd asked, his tone skeptical but not dismissive. Margaret had nodded, explaining her idea with a clarity and confidence that belied her position. It was a simple but clever plan, one that required shifting resources and making quick decisions. Robert had listened, his expression shifting from skepticism to intrigue to outright admiration. By the time she finished, he wasn't just impressed, he was convinced. "That's brilliant," he had said, shaking his head in disbelief. "How is it that you're cleaning floors instead of running this place?" Margaret had smiled, her cheeks flushing. "Just working my way through college, sir." That moment had been the beginning of everything. Robert had offered her a job on the spot, one that paid better and aligned with her ambitions. Over the years, their professional relationship had deepened into something far more profound. Together, they had faced countless challenges, prejudices, setbacks, betrayals, but they had built something extraordinary, an airline that stood for fairness and excellence, a testament to their shared values and unshakable bond. The sound of footsteps broke Margaret's reverie, and she looked up to see Sarah standing by her seat, a tray of refreshments in her hands. "Can I get you anything, ma'am?" Sarah asked, her voice kind but tinged with hesitation. Margaret closed her book, offering Sarah a small, knowing smile. "Just some tea, dear, thank you." Sarah placed the teacup on Margaret's tray. She hesitated. "If you don't mind me saying," Sarah began cautiously, "the way you handled everything earlier, it was inspiring." Margaret chuckled softly. "Inspiring, you say? I suppose that's one way to put it." "I mean it," Sarah continued, her words tumbling out faster now. "I've seen situations like this before, but the way you stayed calm, the way you didn't let it rattle you, I hope I can handle myself like that someday." Margaret studied Sarah for a moment, seeing in her the same spark she had seen in herself all those years ago. "You have more strength than you realize," Margaret said gently. "The key is knowing when to stand your ground and when to let others reveal who they really are." Sarah nodded, her admiration for Margaret growing with each passing moment. As she turned to leave, Margaret spoke again, her tone warm but firm. "And Sarah, don't let anyone make you doubt your place. Not here, not anywhere." At the back of the plane, Emily returned to the galley, her thoughts swirling. She felt like she was standing on a precipice, teetering between redemption and disgrace. Her pride screamed at her to double down, to justify her actions, but a quieter, nagging voice whispered something different. "You need to fix this." She wasn't sure how to do that, not yet. Meanwhile, Michael Chen was typing furiously on his phone. The video he had captured was now live, and the notifications were already rolling in. He glanced up toward Margaret, a flicker of respect in his eyes. The world needed to see this, he thought, not just the confrontation, but the grace with which she had handled it. People like her didn't just demand respect, they commanded it. The intercom crackled again. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We'd like to remind everyone to remain seated for the duration of the flight. Thank you for your cooperation." Margaret's lips curved into a faint smile. Robert's influence was already working its magic. She took a sip of her tea, letting its warmth spread through her. Across the cabin, passengers whispered among themselves, their curiosity piqued. Emily, standing in the galley, clenched her fists. She could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on her, but this time she didn't retreat. She took a deep breath and stepped forward. Her story wasn't over yet. Margaret closed her book and placed it gently on her lap, her gaze drifting toward the window. Outside, the clouds rolled softly beneath the plane, a picture of calm that sharply contrasted the brewing storm inside. She had dealt with situations like this before, but this one felt different. The quiet buzz of whispers among the passengers was growing louder. Something was happening, and Margaret could feel it in the air. Across the aisle, Michael Chen's phone buzzed incessantly. The video he had posted only minutes ago had already begun spreading like wildfire. His social media feed was now flooded with reactions, comments, and shares. The hashtag Justice for Margaret was gaining momentum, and with every passing second, more eyes were turning toward the incident that had unfolded on this flight. Michael glanced toward Margaret, who sat with a serene expression, oblivious, or perhaps indifferent, to the growing chaos her dignity had sparked. In the galley, Emily's composure was beginning to crack. Her shoulders were stiff, and her hands trembled as she clutched a clipboard, pretending to busy herself with routine tasks. Her mind was elsewhere, replaying Robert's voice, the stares of the passengers and the sting of her own actions. The weight of judgment pressed down on her, heavier with each passing moment. "Emily," Sarah's voice broke the silence, her tone calm but firm. "I think you need to step back and take a moment." Emily turned sharply, her frustration spilling over. "What do you want me to say, Sarah? That I messed up? Fine, I messed up. But this is more than just a mistake. Do you know what they're going to do to me?" Sarah tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "You're right, it's more than a mistake. But how you handle it now will matter more than what you've already done." Emily opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, she turned away, gripping the edge of the counter as though it could anchor her. Sarah watched her for a moment longer before sighing softly and stepping back into the aisle. Meanwhile, in a sleek boardroom thousands of miles away, Charles Wilson paced the length of his office, the polished floor reflecting his agitation. A tablet rested on the conference table, displaying an email with the subject line, "Incident Report, Flight 427. Wilson's lips curled into a satisfied smirk as he skimmed the details. To him this was more than just an incident. It was an opportunity. He picked up the tablet and swiped through the attached video clip, his expression sharpening as he watched Emily confront Margaret. "Perfect," he muttered under his breath. Wilson had been waiting for an excuse to undermine Robert Carter, the founder whose vision of fairness and inclusivity clashed so deeply with Wilson's own cutthroat ambitions. This video was exactly what he needed, a crack in the Carter legacy that he could exploit. "Get me legal," Wilson barked into his phone. "I want to know every protocol that was breached on that flight and make sure the media spin focuses on the crew's failure to maintain professionalism." He ended the call and leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. This could be the turning point he had been waiting for. Back on the plane, Sarah approached Margaret's seat cautiously. "Ma'am, I just wanted to check in. Is there anything you need?" Margaret looked up, her expression softening as she met Sarah's gaze. "No, dear." Sarah hesitated, then spoke again, her voice quieter. "If I'm being honest, I'm glad I was here to witness what happened earlier. You showed a lot of grace. I don't think many people would have handled it the way you did." Margaret gave a small smile, but there was a flicker of something deeper in her eyes, something Sarah couldn't quite place. "Grace is important," Margaret said, her voice steady, "but so is accountability." Remember that, Sarah. There will always be moments when you're called to make a choice, and those choices define who you are. Sarah nodded, the weight of Margaret's words settling over her. "Thank you," she said simply, before walking back toward the galley. Margaret watched her go, her smile fading as she turned her attention back to the window. She wasn't naive. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Hours later, as the plane began its descent, Margaret felt her phone buzz in her handbag. She pulled it out, her brows furrowing slightly at the flood of notifications. News of the incident had spread far beyond the confines of the plane. Headlines were beginning to pop up, and Margaret's name was now tied to a growing social media movement, demanding justice and accountability. At the same time, in the galley, Emily's phone buzzed with a very different kind of notification. A message from management had come through, instructing her to report to an immediate internal investigation upon landing. Her chest tightened as she read the words. She had known this was coming, but that didn't make it any easier. Flashbacks swirled through Emily's mind as she stared blankly at the message. She saw herself as a child, sitting at her family's dinner table, listening to conversations laced with prejudice. Her father, a man deeply rooted in outdated beliefs, had always spoken with disdain about anyone who didn't look or think like him. Those words had shaped Emily more than she cared to admit. And now, standing in the galley of Flight 427, she felt the full weight of those inherited biases crashing down on her. For the first time, Emily allowed herself to question everything. Was this who she wanted to be? Was this the legacy she wanted to carry forward? The questions clawed at her, refusing to be ignored. As the plane landed and taxied to the gate, Margaret felt a sense of calm wash over her. She knew the real battle was just beginning, but she also knew she wasn't alone in it. Robert would ensure that justice was served, and Margaret herself had never been one to back down from a fight. Sarah approached her one last time before disembarkation. "Ma'am, I hope you know there are people here who see what's happening and we won't stay silent." Margaret reached out, placing a gentle hand on Sarah's arm. "Thank you, dear. Your courage will carry you far. Don't ever lose it." As Margaret stepped off the plane, she felt the weight of the world's eyes on her, but she carried herself with the same dignity and strength that had defined her life. She wasn't just a passenger anymore. She was the catalyst for something much larger, a change that had long been overdue. The boardroom was silent, except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. The polished mahogany table stretched out like a battlefield, with Charles Wilson standing at its head. His confidence was palpable, radiating from the precise way he adjusted his tie to the self-assured smirk playing on his lips. This was his moment. He was ready to present his vision for the airline's future, a future that didn't include Robert Carter or the ideals he so stubbornly upheld. At the other end of the table, Robert sat with an air of quiet authority. His presence, though less flamboyant than Wilson's, commanded respect. Margaret sat beside him, her hands resting calmly on the table. Her expression was unreadable, but her gaze never wavered. She had seen men like Wilson before, ambitious, calculating, and entirely self-serving. This wasn't her first battle, and it wouldn't be her last. Wilson cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Ladies and gentlemen, as you're all aware, our recent incident on Flight 427 has brought considerable attention to our airline. While the specifics are still under investigation, it's clear that we must act decisively to address the fallout and restore confidence in our brand." He tapped a button on his tablet, projecting a presentation onto the large screen behind him. Charts and graphs detailing operational efficiencies and policy adjustments filled the screen, but Margaret's sharp eye caught the subtext. Wilson's plan wasn't about fairness or improvement, it was about consolidating power. "As you'll see," Wilson continued, gesturing to the screen, These changes will streamline our operations and ensure that incidents like this never happen again. It's time for us to move beyond outdated practices and adopt a more modern approach to leadership. The quiet click of the boardroom door drew everyone's attention. All heads turned as Margaret stood, her heels clicking softly against the floor as she made her way to the front of the room. The murmur of whispers grew louder, and even Wilson faltered for a moment, his smirk faltering as she approached. "Before we get swept up in Mr. Wilson's grand vision," Margaret began, her voice calm but firm, "I'd like to offer a different perspective." She placed a folder on the table, opening it to reveal a series of documents. "This," she said, holding up a piece of paper, "is a testimony from Sarah Rodriguez, one of the flight attendants on Flight 427. It outlines not just what happened during the incident, but also the culture of fear and discrimination that has been allowed to fester under Mr. Wilson's leadership." Wilson stiffened, his smirk replaced by a glare. "This is highly inappropriate," he interjected. "We're here to discuss strategy, not unsubstantiated allegations." Margaret met his gaze without flinching. "Oh, these aren't allegations, Mr. Wilson. They're facts." She slid another document across the table. "This one's signed by Michael Chen. This is a statement from a passenger who witnessed the entire incident. He also happens to be a shareholder. His video of the incident has already been viewed by millions." The murmurs grew louder as the board members exchanged glances. Wilson's confidence was slipping, but he wasn't ready to back down. "Even if these events occurred as described," he said, his tone clipped, "they don't reflect on my leadership. If anything, they highlight the need for stricter oversight and better training." Margaret raised an eyebrow, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Stricter oversight? Is that what you call threatening employees who speak out? Because I have another document here, signed by several current and former employees, detailing the tactics you've used to silence dissent." Robert, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. His voice was steady but carried the weight of authority. "Charles, your vision for this airline has always been clear to anyone paying attention. But let me remind you of the vision this company was built on. Fairness, inclusion, integrity. That's what our passengers trust us to deliver, and that's what we owe them." The tension in the room was thick as Wilson attempted to regain control. "This is a distraction," he said, his voice rising. "We need to focus on the future, not dwell on isolated incidents." Margaret took a step closer, her calm demeanor unshaken. "The future of this airline depends on addressing these issues, not sweeping them under the rug. The passengers and employees who trust us deserve better, and they won't wait for us to figure it out. They're already watching." She turned to the board members, her gaze sweeping across the room. "You've seen the headlines, you've read the comments. This isn't just about one flight or one incident. This is about who we are as a company and who we want to be moving forward. The question is, will we stand for what's right, or will we let fear and convenience dictate our actions?" Wilson's knuckles turned white as he gripped the edge of the table. "This is outrageous," he hissed. "You have no authority to speak on behalf of this airline." Margaret tilted her head slightly, her smile cool and composed. "You're right. I don't, but Robert does, and so do the passengers and employees whose voices are finally being heard." At that moment, the door opened again, and Sarah walked in, her back straight and her eyes clear. She carried a folder of her own, which she placed in front of the board members. "These are my own observations as a flight attendant on Flight 427, she said, her voice steady. "It details the systemic issues we faced under Mr. Wilson's leadership, and I'm not the only one. There are more of us willing to speak up." The room fell silent as the weight of her words settled over everyone. Wilson's expression darkened, but he said nothing. He knew he was cornered. At this pivotal moment, as Sarah's courage shines and Wilson's power crumbles, remember how impactful speaking out against injustice can be. If this story resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel to follow Margaret's journey and more stories like this one. Together, we can amplify these voices and inspire real change. Margaret stepped back, letting Sarah take the floor. The younger woman's courage reminded her of her younger self, of the time she had stepped forward to offer a solution when no one else would. As Sarah spoke, outlining the changes the airline needed, Margaret felt a flicker of hope. Change was never easy, but it was always worth fighting for. When Sarah finished, Robert rose from his seat. "Thank you, Sarah," he said, his voice filled with pride. "Your bravery exemplifies what this company should stand for, and as long as I'm here, it will." The board members began to murmur amongst themselves, their conversations growing louder as they debated their next steps. Wilson, sensing his position slipping away, tried one final time to assert himself. "We need a vote," he demanded. "The board should decide what's best for this airline." Robert nodded. "I couldn't agree more. Let's vote." One by one, the board members cast their votes. When the final tally was announced, Wilson's face fell. The decision was clear. His time at the airline was over. Margaret felt a sense of relief wash over her, but she knew this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be long, and the changes they needed to implement would face resistance. But for now, she allowed herself a small victory. She turned to Sarah and smiled. "This is just the start, dear. Now we build something better." The hum of the aircraft filled the cabin, a steady backdrop to the unfolding stories aboard. Margaret sat quietly in her first-class seat, sipping tea with her usual poise. The events of the last 24 hours swirled in her mind, yet her composure remained unshaken. Beside her, Robert glanced up from his tablet, catching the faint smile on her lips. He knew that smile well. It was the one she wore when she had a plan. Further back, Emily walked the aisle with measured steps, her polished smile more fragile than ever. The aftermath of the boardroom vote lingered in her mind. Wilson's abrupt exit from the airline had sent ripples through the ranks. For Emily, it had shattered the illusion of stability she had clung to for years. Now, every glance from her colleagues felt like judgment, every whisper like condemnation. But somewhere deep inside, a voice stirred, one she hadn't heard in years. It was the voice of change, faint but insistent. The night after the board meeting had been restless for Emily. She had sat in her tiny apartment, replaying the day's events over and over. Margaret's words echoed in her mind, their weight pressing against the walls she had built around herself. The key is knowing when to stand your ground and when to let others reveal who they really are. Emily had always prided herself on control, on projecting perfection, but for the first time, she was beginning to see how that control had blinded her. Her father's voice, stern and unwavering, had been a constant presence in her upbringing. "People like us have to protect what's ours," he would say, his words laced with prejudice and fear. Those lessons had shaped her, creating a worldview she now questioned. Was this really who she wanted to be? Emily wasn't sure anymore. Back on the flight, Sarah busied herself in the galley, organizing trays and tidying shelves with meticulous care. But her mind wasn't on her tasks. It was on Margaret, on the way she had turned the tide with calm strength and unwavering conviction. Sarah couldn't help but admire her, and that admiration stirred something new, a determination to take her own stand. She glanced toward the cabin door, where Emily stood, staring out the small window at the clouds beyond. Taking a breath, Sarah approached Emily. "Emily," she began, her voice steady but kind, "I know things have been difficult, but I think there's an opportunity here." Emily turned, her eyes wary. "An opportunity?" she repeated, her tone edged with skepticism. "Yes," Sarah said firmly, "to make things right, to change how people see you, and maybe how you see yourself." Emily looked away, her jaw tightening. "It's not that simple." "No, it's not," Sarah admitted, but nothing worth doing ever is. Meanwhile, in first class, Margaret glanced at her watch. The flight was nearing its final hour, and the sense of anticipation in the cabin was palpable. Passengers who had witnessed the earlier events now watched her with quiet respect. Their curiosity mingled with admiration. Margaret felt their eyes, but didn't let it distract her. She had spent a lifetime navigating these waters, and she knew that change rarely came without resistance. The intercom crackled, and the captain's voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts." As the cabin buzzed with activity, Emily took a deep breath and made her way to Margaret's seat. The older woman looked up, her expression warm but unreadable. "Mrs. Carter," Emily began, her voice faltering slightly, I wanted to say I'm sorry for everything." Margaret studied her for a moment, her gaze calm and penetrating. "Thank you, Emily," she said softly, "but apologies are only the first step. What matters is what you do next." Emily nodded, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "I don't know where to start," she admitted. Margaret smiled faintly. "You've already started, dear. Now keep going." As the plane touched down and taxied to the gate, Margaret felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. The storm was not over, but the winds were shifting. She glanced at Robert, who gave her a knowing smile. They had faced storms before, and together they had always found their way through. Sarah, standing near the galley, caught Margaret's eye as passengers began to disembark. Margaret nodded slightly, a gesture of encouragement that Sarah returned with a small, determined smile. Change was coming, not just for the airline, but for the people within it. And as Emily watched the last passenger step off the plane, she felt something stir within her. Something she hadn't felt in years: hope. The sound of Margaret's steady voice echoed through the small conference room, a place now buzzing with purpose. Her presence commanded the room, but it was her words that captivated the senior executives gathered around the polished mahogany table. The ripple effects of the Flight 427 incident had reached far and wide, and this meeting was an urgent response to the storm it had unleashed. "This isn't just about one flight or one incident," Margaret began, her tone firm but calm. "This is about who we are as a company and the values we claim to uphold. If we don't take a stand now, we'll be defined by our silence." Robert nodded beside her, his face set in quiet determination. For years he had fought to build an airline that prioritized fairness and respect. Now, with Margaret leading the charge, that vision felt closer than ever, even as resistance loomed. The fallout from the incident was everywhere. Social media had erupted with hashtags like #JusticeForMargaret and #FlyFair, flooding timelines and sparking debates across the country. Michael Chen's video, which captured the tense confrontation between Margaret and Emily, had gone viral overnight, drawing millions of views and thousands of comments. Some praised Margaret's grace under pressure, while others criticized the airline's lack of accountability. The public was demanding answers, and the airline had no choice but to respond. Margaret's composure amidst the chaos had earned her admiration, but it also placed her in the spotlight. Invitations from news outlets and conferences poured in, all seeking her voice on systemic discrimination and corporate responsibility. Yet amidst the growing attention, Margaret remained focused on what mattered most: real change. In the weeks following the boardroom showdown, Sarah had stepped into a more active role within the company. Inspired by Margaret's encouragement, she began working on new initiatives to address the biases and inequities that had plagued their workplace for years. Her efforts were not without challenges, but Sarah had discovered a quiet strength she hadn't realized she possessed. One afternoon, as Sarah reviewed a proposal for diversity training programs, she noticed Emily standing hesitantly in the doorway of the break room. The younger woman's usual confidence was absent, replaced by a vulnerability that made Sarah pause. "Hey," Sarah said, breaking the silence. Emily shifted uncomfortably before stepping inside. I just wanted to say thank you for not giving up on me. Sarah raised an eyebrow, setting the proposal aside. You're thanking me? After everything? Emily nodded, her gaze dropping to the floor. I've been going to the training sessions. They're uncomfortable, but I think I needed that. I've been so focused on my own image, my own success, that I didn't realize how blind I was to everything else. Sarah's expression softened. Acknowledging it is a start, but change takes more than just recognition. You have to act. I know, Emily said quietly. I'm trying. For the first time, Sarah saw the cracks in Emily's polished exterior, not as flaws, but as openings for growth. It wasn't redemption yet, but it was a step in the right direction. While these small shifts unfolded within the company, the industry at large was beginning to take notice. Other airlines, facing their own internal reckonings, started to implement diversity initiatives inspired by the public's outcry. Margaret's name became synonymous with accountability and integrity, and her influence extended beyond the confines of her own company. She was invited to speak at a national aviation conference, where leaders from across the industry gathered to address systemic issues in their organizations. Standing at the podium, Margaret felt the weight of the moment, but she also felt the support of those who believed in her vision.